Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Mark is one of the leading voices at the cutting edge of sociology of law in the world today, internationalizing the discipline and pushing its boundaries with his research that addresses the relationship between law, politics, and religion in various contexts. His work, in some ways, tackles big questions about the creation and maintenance of states and about how law and religion are used in tandem as the foundation of many states. And that's something particularly worth noting. The wide reach and influence of Mark's work across disciplines is a testament to his scholarly courage to push beyond established conventions and accepted truths and to tackle head-on the big questions that we are faced with today. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to Lund, Mark.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good afternoon. Thank you to those of you who are online, to those of you who came into the room. I want to thank the Sociology of Law Department here at Lund University, also Michael Malavi, for inviting me to be here to share my research with you. It is an honor and a pleasure to give this year's Reza Banakar Lecture, Memorial Lecture. He finished his PhD here in 1994. And then he rejoined the department in 2013, which would be a kind of career high for anyone studying the sociology of law, anyone in the field of law and society to come join this department. And he worked here until his death 7 years later in 2020. Both Reza and I immigrated from non-English speaking countries to English speaking countries. He from Iran to the United Kingdom, me from Sudan to the United States. We both studied, we both became socio-legal scholars. We both have cared deeply in our work about questions of authoritarianism, the rule of law, religion, the relationship between law and politics. Legal pluralism is something that has come up in both of our work. We both studied Western and Islamic cultures and tried to convince people that for some people in the world, religion, especially for a lot of Muslims, Sharia in particular, is an important source of knowledge, an important source of understanding. Another parallel between our work in our writing and in our teaching, both of us have cared deeply about methods. Both of us have cared deeply about pushing the field of socio-legal studies forward by thinking about how socio-legal studies does the work that it does. Methodologically, and what socio-legal studies even means through the methods that it adopts. I think Reza Banakar's work is theoretically sophisticated, it's empirically rigorous, and I've tried to emulate this in my own career. Most important to me around the kind of parallels between my life, my professional work, and Reza Banakar's life and his professional work is that we both spent much of our careers looking out and looking in. So he was sometimes looking out at Iran from Sweden and looking back at Sweden as being someone from Iran in Sweden. I often spent a large part of my career looking out back at Sudan and looking in back at the United States as someone who traverses these boundaries, both being in place somewhere and also being out of place somewhere. This kind of in-betweenness, being in place and being out of place, being sometimes feeling like we fit in and sometimes feeling like we don't quite fit in, and being able to see things in that kind of way, which I think Reza Banakar and I are not the only people. I think all of us in this room have times in our lives when we are in place and when we are out of place, or when we kind of feel that in-betweenness. And I think that moment of in-betweenness, I think is a great starting point for socio-legal scholarship, for any kind of interdisciplinary social science scholarship. And that's what I want to focus on today. That's what I want to orient your attention to today, that kind of in-betweenness, being inside and outside. So today's lecture forms the basis of an introductory chapter that I wrote for a forthcoming book. I just put that book up on the screen. It comes out just in a few weeks in March from Cambridge University Press. It's a book on fieldwork and positionality in law and society. I co-edited the volume with my colleague Lynette Chua. She is based at the National University of Singapore. The volume features 10 socio-legal scholars from around the world who adopt this kind of, much like Reza Banakar did during his lifetime, this kind of in-placeness and out-of-placeness, and what it means to be out of place, what it means to think about and reflect on your social position, your marginality, your privilege while you're doing your research. And that's what this volume really focuses on, is those stories of those people who do just that. I want to acknowledge briefly the research support I received and that Lynette and I both received to put this book volume together from the Ministry of Education of Singapore, as well as from the University of California in Santa Cruz, and the current support that I'm receiving as a Berlin Prize Fellow of the American Academy in Berlin, where I'm currently based. So in my talk today, I want to give attention. I want us to give our attention to this idea of how our backgrounds, where we come from, the places we've been, our backgrounds, our experiences of marginalization, or our experiences of privilege. And all of us, to some extent, have some experiences of privilege and some experiences of marginalization. And I want us just to be attuned to our experiences, our marginalization, our backgrounds, our privileges, because all of these things influence the research that we do in socio-legal studies. And I say socio-legal studies, when I say socio-legal studies, I'm also saying law and society, I'm also saying sociology of law. I know there are debates around what these terms mean. I use the terms interchangeably, socio-legal studies, law and society, just for ease in the context of the talk today. So our backgrounds, our privileges, our marginalization, they influence the fieldwork we do, they influence the findings that we share, they influence the questions that we ask in our research. The prevalent term for this is positionality. You may have heard other concepts or terms, standpoint theory, that comes from gender studies or feminist studies. Our colleagues just downstairs in the gender studies department have worked on standpoint theory for 20, 30, 40 years now. So you may have heard that term. Some people in fields of sociology, in politics, and other disciplines use the term reflexivity. I see these terms, positionality, reflexivity, standpoint theory, as different ways of saying the same things. What do I mean? What is that same thing? It is exposing, it is opening up ourselves, not just our ideas, not just the research that we do, not just our scholarship. It's opening up ourselves to criticism. It's opening up ourselves for other people to engage with us, not just about our ideas, but about kind of who we are and our backgrounds, and not just our ideas. And so my main argument to you today, to return to the original screen, my main argument to you today is about knowing ourselves and about embracing this power of positionality in research. We have reached a critical point, I think, in the field of law and society where an interest in identity is growing, and where our field, to be honest with you, is growing in terms of its diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, gender identity diversity, and other forms of diversity. And because of this diversity and that growing interest in identity that I mentioned, positionality for a lot of people is about expressing their marginality, how they feel different from people in the majority, the ways that we might feel out of place, that out of placeness that I spoke about. And it's not just how many people feel out of place in their research, but also how people can feel out of place in the academy, as scholars, as students. And I want to talk about that today as well. So let me frame my argument about the power of positionality briefly in the context of my own research over the last couple of decades. And here, permit me for a moment to draw on the ancient Greek philosophers. So about 3,400 years ago, the ancient Greeks erected a temple called the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And in the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, there were various inscriptions, some carved outside the temple, some carved inside the temple. And just inside the temple, there were two inscriptions carved inside the temple of Apollo at Delphi. And the first one was follow God. And the second one that was carved inside the temple was obey the law. follow God, and obey the law. Now, my own scholarship over the past 2 decades, in my 2 books that you see on the screen, and also I will pass them around the room for those of you who are interested, my own scholarship has discussed these 2 Delphic maxims, follow God and obey the law, in the context of international law and from the time of colonialism to the present day in Eastern Africa. What I learned from writing these books is that colonial administrators, dictators, democratically minded progressive government officials, also human rights activists and human rights lawyers and international lawyers with the United Nations. These are very different kinds of people. And all of them were encouraging people who were survivors of war to obey the law as if it were some kind of God, to obey the law and to follow the law as if it were some kind of God. Okay, so follow God and obey the law. I spent the better part of 2 decades, maybe a little more than 2 decades, writing about these 2 Delphic maxims in ancient Greek philosophy and in ancient Greek theology. But there's a third. There's a third Delphic maxim. These 2, follow God and obey the law, were inscribed inside the temple of Apollo. There's a third one that was inscribed outside so that people could see it and people could feel it on the wall, on the inscription on the stone wall as they entered the temple. And that inscription was this: know yourself, know yourself, know yourself. It is one of the earliest known statements of positionality. As Aristotle said, know yourself because it is the beginning of all wisdom. Knowing ourselves is the beginning of all wisdom. So to make this argument about knowing ourselves, I want to just share my roadmap of my talk that I want to give you this afternoon. To make this argument about the importance of knowing ourselves and about the importance of embracing the power of positionality, I want to do 3 things. The first thing I'll do is I'll talk about fieldwork as a kind of research method from which a lot of people begin their discussions of positionality. So I'll talk about fieldwork, what it means, why it's important, how it relates to the field of sociology of law. Second, I'll discuss positionality, and I'll do that in 3 parts. So the second part of my talk has 3 subparts. The first subpart is I'll talk about the benefits of positionality. Why is it maybe a good thing for the field that people are talking about positionality? Then I'll talk about the second subpart of my discussion of positionality is who's actually talking about positionality in their research? Who's doing it and why are they doing it? And then I'll talk about in the third subpart of this second part of my talk today, I'll talk about the price of positionality, or what are the consequences, maybe sometimes negative consequences, for discussing positionality. So that's the second part. So again, the first part, discussing fieldwork. Second part, the benefits of positionality, who's doing it, the price of positionality. And then I'll close the last maybe 10 minutes or so. I'll talk about embracing what I've come to call a position sensibility in our research. Even if we don't think about positionality in our work, what does it mean to embrace a kind of just a sensibility around positionality, just to become a little more comfortable with it? And so I'll close with that. So that's the roadmap of what we're doing this afternoon. Let me start with that first point that's now highlighted on the screen on fieldwork. The 20th century American anthropologist, one of the founders of the field of anthropology in the United States. Her name is Margaret Mead. There's a photo of her on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And she wrote that, at least for the anthropologist, and here I'll quote what's on the left-hand side of the screen, she says, "The only logical place for the anthropologist is in the field. The most perfect way of laying a solid basis for theory is in the field." Now, I like this quote, but it also begs the question, what does it mean to be in the field? What does it mean to do field work? Now, anthropologists have debated this question. We could have a whole separate conversation, and I know I'm meeting with some of the graduate students later about what it means to do field work. One definition of field work that I like comes from this person named John van Manen. And John van Manen defines fieldwork as, and I want to read the definition that's on the screen. He says fieldwork is a technique of gathering research material by subjecting ourselves, by subjecting the self, our bodies, our beliefs, our personalities, our emotions, our cognitions, to a set of contingencies, and he goes on to say, such that a scholar can, over time, come to understand the kinds of responses that other people display in their social situations. So what I like about this definition of fieldwork is that Van Manen recognizes that the field worker is influencing the research by subjecting, and in turn being influenced by the research, by subjecting themselves, their bodies, their emotions, their personalities, their cognitions. We are a part of our research, and our research is making us as we do our research. And that's what happens in fieldwork. That's why it's the solid basis of anthropology for someone like Margaret Mead. It's this interaction between ourselves and others. We are a part of our research. And because of how we do our research, how we influence our research, anthropologists have long debated whether fieldwork is even useful. This is a huge debate in the field of anthropology, whether fieldwork is even a useful form of knowledge production. Here's a quote by my colleague at the University of California, Santa Cruz, James Clifford. He goes by Jim Clifford. So Jim Clifford says in one of his books called Writing Culture, some of you may know this, it's about 40 years old now. He says, he's an intellectual historian, he critiques the field of anthropology, and he says, how on earth is a garrulous, overdetermined, cross-cultural encounter that's shot through with power relations and personal cross-purposes even composed by an individual author? When you have things that are shot through with power relations and personal cross-purposes, and anthropologists are trying to make their own tenure in their universities, and they're trying to make their own careers, and they're trying to understand these people, how do you even compose all of that and say that this is useful knowledge? So he was really criticizing the field of, the fundamental methodological basis of the field of anthropology, which in many ways law and society or socio-legal studies has drawn from. He's critiquing the kind of foundation of the field. Now for me, I understand these critiques, but fieldwork has also been essential for my own work. And it's been essential for a lot of people in their work. Archives, going to archives, which I think is a form of fieldwork, doing interviews, speaking with people, attending workshops, as I did, of United Nations agencies, learning about what those agencies are doing on the ground in places with histories of war or conflict. All of these things help me understand the meaning that people give to contested concepts like law or rights or Sharia for my second book. And it helps me understand the risks that people take to give meaning to those concepts that are contested and how those concepts are contested. And when I think of risks, I also think of the fact that many field workers go through risks, and I had my own set of risks. The image that you see on the screen is a hospital bed from Somaliland, where I was doing my research for my book Sharia Insha'Allah. And this is an image I took the morning after I spent the night in this hospital, where doctors said I may have contracted amoebic dysentery or cholera. One doctor suggested I contracted both of these diseases at the same time. And I remember as I was laying by this hospital bed, and I write about this in the book as well, it was late one night, and there was a lawyer sitting at the foot of this bed, and he was praying. He was praying to God to sustain me, to sustain me. As I was sick, you can see the IV drip that was connected to my right hand, that the nurses had connected to my hand. He was praying to God to sustain me. And he was a lawyer. And I learned, partly through that moment, but also through other hints that I was getting in my fieldwork and other images I was receiving in my fieldwork, that his prayers motivated not only his desire for my recovery from my illness, but also all the legal work that he was doing, something that the United Nations officials he was working with were missing. His prayers, his desire, his faith, his prayers, his belief in God, his belief in a higher power motivated not just his hopefulness for my recovery, but also his hopefulness for the nation that he lived in. And so I began to notice the power of faith through this experience, through the experience of risk in fieldwork. And other field workers have experienced other kinds of risks. In 1998, the anthropologist Susan Hirsch wrote a book. Actually, she survived a terrorist bombing. Her husband was killed. She survived a terrorist bombing in 1998 in East Africa. And her husband, as I said, was killed. And she wrote a book called In the Moment of Greatest Calamity about her experience with the legal process as a result of the terrorist bombings. The next photo that came up on the screen is of Giulio Regeni, a Cambridge University doctoral student whose body was found in a roadside ditch in 2016 in Cairo. And some research has suggested that his doctoral research on trade unions in Egypt may have made him a target while he was doing his field work. Fariba Adokha, professor at Sciences Po in Paris, was imprisoned in Iran in June of 2019. She was recently released after 4 years in prison, and she returned to her position in Sciences Po just a few weeks ago in late 2023. With the dangers and risks of fieldwork, not just getting sick as I was sick, but much more clear and present dangers as these other researchers have experienced, it's difficult for me to somehow think that we can separate ourselves from the research that we do, from the work that we do as academics, from our experiences that we have in fieldwork. It's difficult for me to think that we can separate our work from our field work. And so let me then turn to the second point I wanted to make with the 3 subpoints that I mentioned. The second point I wanted to make about positionality. Because positionality for a lot of people is difficult to set aside. It's difficult to set aside. Both to set aside as in not thinking about it, but also to set aside as in to compartmentalize it. For a lot of people, positionality is the conversation. It's not it's not a side part of the conversation. I want to make sure I make that point clear. Let me share with you an experience that I had about 15 years ago when I first was on the academic job market. I was looking for my first academic position. I just finished my PhD, and I was interviewing for an academic job, and I was sitting across from a professor. He was a full professor and a leading figure in the field. And I was in his office, and I was filled with anxiety because if he said, no, we shouldn't hire this person, then I would not have been hired. And so I knew that I needed to answer his questions. I needed to be very kind to him. He was the person I needed to please, in addition to the other people I was interviewing with. And I was ready to answer any of his questions about my field work on human rights law. And during the interview, he asked me questions about my childhood. He asked me questions about the languages I spoke growing up. He asked me questions about my background. He asked me questions about my parents. He asked me a lot of personal questions. It could have been that United States, it's an ethnically multicultural society, and he was trying to get to know me. But I'm also a lawyer, and I know that his questions in the context of a job interview were against the law. They were not consistent with American fair hiring practices and US employment law. But I wanted to be nice. And I answered all his questions. And I needed a job. I was in my postdoctoral fellowship. And the postdoc comes to an end and you need a job. So I answered all of his questions. And when I was alone later that night in my hotel room, I was crying. I was crying. Not because, partly because I didn't want to talk about personal matters with this person. I mean, I revealed more to this person than some of my close friends even knew about me. But also because I was powerless. I felt powerless to assert my rights. My desire to be accepted, my desire to get a job had completely replaced my academic and legal training in this job interview. This episode at this job interview, I think, highlights the racial and ethnic advantages and the class and cultural privileges that exist in our societies, but especially in academia. Intellectual hierarchies, cultural hierarchies, social economic hierarchies. I cannot compartmentalize my experiences at work, like that job interview, from my experiences at field work, as I said earlier. That is because just as I was in that job interview, I am adjudicated by people who see an Arab man from Sudan with a Christian accent and a California, with an Arab background and a California accent, both when I arrive in my field work and also when I arrive in the context of a job interview. But who actually does that? Who actually shares positionality, as I just tried to do just with one story? Who does that in their research? Before I get to who does that, let me talk about why they might do it. Let me talk first about why they might do it. So this is that first subpoint of the second point I wanted to make, the benefits of positionality. Let's talk about the benefits of positionality. Disclosing one's positionality can happen in a research paper. It often happens in a methods section. I've seen a couple of papers where instead of saying research methods as a kind of subsection in the research paper, it says methods and positionality. So that's often where it happens. Let me talk about why it happens. Positionality can create personal connections with readers. For instance, if the author and the readers share an identity characteristic in common, then the readers can say, oh yeah, this author is kind of like me. Or the author can say, it can build the author's confidence when they feel like their identity characteristic is not represented in the academic work that they review, that they read. Positionality can also, this is the second bullet point, establish an author's credibility, an author's voice, an author's authority. It can allow a reader to understand how an author got access, why people spoke to the author or didn't speak to the author if the author shares positionality. In my own two books that are going around the room, I disclosed and shared how my own background from Sudan provided me with access to some lawyers and officials and activists, but also how my background from America led some people to decide not to talk with me because of my American background. It led them to turn away. Likewise, my status as a man got me into some meetings with some officials who were more than happy to meet with another man because we live in a gendered world, and a lot of the places I studied were very, very gendered. But also my status as a man made it, in some cases, more inappropriate for some women to meet with me for those same gendered reasons. In one experience I had, I recall meeting with a young woman lawyer, and we were sitting outside a courthouse, and she was in her 20s, very sophisticated young woman, lawyer, and I wanted to ask her about her experiences as a lawyer, and these other lawyers, these male lawyers, were kind of taunting her for sitting with me, and I do not look Somali, and they knew I was not a Somali man, and they were taunting her for sitting in public outside the courthouse with me, a non-Somali. So I asked her about this, and she said, yes, that's what they were doing, but also it led her to reveal, that put her at risk, to speak with me. But it also led her to reveal to me that part of what was happening was the animosity that these young male lawyers had towards young women lawyers, because United Nations aid agencies were paying the legal education fees of the young women lawyers. So the young women lawyers were going to law school for free. The young men lawyers had to get the money to fund their own legal educations. The United Nations was paying, they wanted to increase the number of women in the legal profession, which led to a lot of resentments amongst the male lawyers, which led the male lawyers then to feel all the more resentful to this young woman for meeting with me, an outsider. Positionality also builds communities. This is the fourth bullet point on the screen. Positionality also builds communities and spaces to challenge oppression. I've been speaking with law and society scholars for a number of years now for this project on positionality, and one of the people I met is a black woman social scientist. And she said, we write our way out of our trauma partly to help others, but also to help ourselves. So partly what she was doing, it's a very different kind of research, which gets to this last bullet point of challenging social science epistemologies. It's a very different kind of research that I was trained to do, to be objective, to be neutral. The word trauma never came up in graduate school for me. That part of research, part of scholarship can be to write our way out of our past, to write our way out of our trauma. But to this person I met, that's exactly what she was trying to do. Not only to help others, other black women social scientists like her, but also partly to help herself. Also partly to help herself, to work through that past, both the past of her ancestors and her own past. And I remember meeting a Somali lawyer, not that young woman I talked about, but another Somali who asserted a kind of group positionality. And this is the quote that's now in blue in the screen. And he said, "We Somalis have been colonized and denigrated, but we never lost our humanity. We never lost our humanity." Like I think this Somali lawyer, many of the people I met in my research on positionality also asserted a kind of group positionality that for them, for their research, again, very different from traditional social science epistemologies of neutrality, for them and for their research, positionality, autobiography is a very important source of knowledge. It is a very important source of knowledge. We just walk downstairs to the gender studies program. People in feminist studies have been doing this. People in critical race theory have been doing this for a very long time, since the 1990s. Thinking about positionality, thinking about autobiography as a source of knowledge in the same way a historical record is a source of knowledge, in the same way that scholarship itself, books and articles are sources of knowledge. Whether it's the black woman social scientist who talked about trauma or this Somali who talked about the collective trauma of colonization. The philosopher Charles Mills had a word for this. He called it smatatizing. It's a Jamaican word. Charles Mills died a year after Reza Banakar. He died in 2021. One of the giants in the field of social and political philosophy. And he called it smatatizing. What he said is, some people in the world, and I think this bears repeating. For some people, this is obvious, but it bears repeating. Some people in the world struggle simply to be seen or heard. That they are seen, they are identified as lesser beings, simply as lesser, almost like they're not human. And he calls this struggle against this historical subordination that some peoples in the world experience. He uses the Jamaican word smatatizing. That some people struggle simply to have their personhood recognized. And I'll get to, in a moment, why that's critical, recognizing personhood, especially for socio-legal scholars. I think because we miss, I'll just plant the idea in your brain for now, because we focus so much in law on the rules that we sometimes miss the persons who are animating and who are subject to those rules and sometimes oppressed by those rules. So lots of benefits of positionality. It creates personal connections. It establishes an author's voice and credibility. We can understand how an author did the work that they did, which is really important for social science. It can build communities. It can challenge traditional social science and build our fields. Lots of benefits. Given all those benefits, you may be thinking, super, amazing. That probably means everyone is sharing positionality in their work, given all of these benefits. Not exactly. Let's talk about who's actually sharing positionality in the field of social science. Now, I know that not many people are sharing positionality in the field of social science because I analyzed every available article from our field's two oldest English language journals. They're called the Law and Society Review, which is based in the United States as part of the Law and Society Association. It's the flagship journal of the Law and Society Association, and the Journal of Law and Society, which is based in the UK. These are the two oldest socio-legal English language journals in the world. Something like 56, 57 years of articles published in these journals. And I analyzed all the available articles and issues in those journals. And what I found is that of the thousands of articles I analyzed, there were 28 articles out of thousands where people discussed positionality or my related search terms. There were something like 30 search terms that I developed. What was even more troubling or interesting around this research that I did is that the very few people who did share their positionality, there were 36, because some articles were co-authored. So there were 36 authors of 28 articles. Of those 36 authors, their own kind of backgrounds was telling. Most of them came from backgrounds that people would identify as historically marginalized in society or in academia in particular. 22 of them self-identified as white women, 9 as women of color, 3 as men of color, and 2 as white men. Now, what this means is that positionality, the big picture finding is that not many people are talking about positionality. Like, it's 36 people out of thousands of articles over nearly 6 decades of research. So the big picture is this is not something that's been very important to our field. The smaller picture is that of the very few, of the tiny, tiny, tiny few people who are talking about positionality, most of them come from marginalized populations, which to me says something interesting. These are people who are opening up themselves and potentially their own marginalization, potentially their own trauma, not just themselves, but also, not just their research, but also themselves. They're opening themselves to criticism. The results of my study of these 2 journals, I think, provide a baseline for thinking about positionality in other fields, politics, cognate fields, sociology, anthropology, history, are, to study positionality in other articles, in journals in those fields, not just in the sociology of law, and then also potentially in books where people necessarily have more space. Again, I focused on articles, not on books. Now, there are limitations to any research like this. There are a number of limitations, but it is likely true that the fraction of scholars who publish in these journals who are women and minorities, who talk about positionality, is much higher than the fraction of white men who do so, simply because our field, sociology of law, has historically been dominated by white men. Indeed, in 2012, when Laura Gomez was the president of the Law and Society Association, she gave a talk on race and color in the field of law and society, and said that the founding members of the field of law and society, at least in the United States, I'm not speaking about Sweden here, I'd love for people during the discussion to mention Sweden, but at least in the United States, the founding members of the field of law and society in the 1960s and 70s were entirely white men except 3 white women. So there were no people of color. So the fraction of women and minorities who are talking about positionality is much higher than the fraction of white men who are doing so, most likely. The next question is, given how few people are discussing positionality, why are they doing it? Why are people talking about positionality? So I asked this question of the authors of those articles. I asked them, so you published this article, I learned that you talked about positionality, so why did you do it? Can you talk with me? And so I set up meetings and I talked with them, or they wrote me back and they explained to me why they discussed it. And some of them said a lot of them talked about how they wanted to explain access, why they got the access that they did. Maybe they shared an identity characteristic. Some of them wanted to explain the power dynamics between the researcher and the population that's being researched. Other people wanted to explain their own privileges, the privileges that they have as being professors or students at wealthy universities. One person spoke about a perceived disrespect of intersectionality, that we have multiple overlapping marginalizations. One person, this person was a scholar in Europe who identified as a disabled researcher. She told me, I am a minority in my discipline. She said that referees and funding councils had told her that they didn't understand why she felt it was important to share that not only was she studying people with disabilities, she also identified as a disabled researcher herself. And they didn't understand why that was important in her research. She said she felt left out. Those were her words. I felt left out. Another person said, and this one is not on the screen, said it would be, this one is on the screen. It would be wildly irresponsible not to grapple with my positionality. A different author I met spoke about how being a white person helped them get access to white police officers. They were studying police officers in the United States. But that is what explained why they couldn't study black police officers. So it helped explain access, why they couldn't study black police officers. Another person I met was working in a kind of doing field work in a local government office that they called a heteronormative environment. And they identified as cisgender heterosexual. And they said being cisgender heterosexual allowed them access to a heteronormative environment. Now, being cisgender heterosexual probably allowed people a lot of access to a lot of environments in academic history. But here's someone who's actually writing about it. Here's someone who's doing the hard work, reflecting on how being cis, being heterosexual, is giving them some kind of access that people who are not cis and not heterosexual maybe don't have. And so I found that very powerful. I found that very, very powerful when I asked them why they were discussing positionality. One of my own articles came up in the 36 authors, 28 articles. So I thought, cool, okay, one of my own articles came up. And after about half a second, I realized I've published other articles in Journal of Law and Society and Law and Society Review. Why didn't those articles come up? Why didn't I discuss positionality in those articles? So I was almost chastising myself, like, wait a second. Okay, maybe one of my articles came up, but what about the other articles I published in these journals? I never talked about positionality in those articles. So I started to reflect on, why didn't I talk about positionality? So maybe with the benefit of hindsight, maybe I didn't talk about positionality because I care about the people I was writing about. And I wanted their stories, not mine, to be the project. I wanted to showcase their stories. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe I didn't talk about positionality because I was actually trained not to talk about positionality. I remember when I was in graduate school receiving the kind of warning from my professors. I was going to Sudan, which was the country of my birth, to study human rights activists. And I remember one of my professors saying, don't go native. Don't go native. Don't become like them. You need to be objective. Don't go native. And so maybe I didn't write about positionality because I was actually told not to write about positionality without the professors actually saying that. So maybe that's why my other articles never appeared in my searches. But just because I didn't write about positionality doesn't mean it wasn't there. Being attuned to my own positionality, becoming more attuned to my own positionality over the years of doing my research has led me to understand how other people are attuned to their own positionality and the ways that positionality is relational, defined in terms of how other people see us. Other people identify us in certain kind of ways, which leads us then to define our own selves in new and different ways, or understand ourselves in new and different ways. I remember when I was in Somaliland doing my research for my book, Sharia, Inshallah, and I met with, I was at a workshop, a United Nations workshop, and someone I knew, and again, a lawyer, and she stood up and she introduced herself, and she said, my name is, let's say, Hanan. She said, my name is X, and she said, I don't know what to call myself. Am I a women's rights activist or am I an environmentalist? In terms of her professional positionality, what she was trying to say is she and her identity, her professional position, indeed her convictions were shaped by the presence of United Nations agencies and international non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Is she an environmentalist? Is she a human rights activist? Is she a women's rights activist? And I learned that people also placed me in different ways because the foreigners who came, notwithstanding my own Sudanese background, the foreigners who came to places like Somalia and Somaliland to do research generally were highly paid consultants for international NGOs or United Nations agencies. And so when I met people for the first time, oftentimes they thought I was a wealthy, high-paid consultant working with one of these agencies. And so I had to push back and say, no, I'm an independent researcher. I'm coming here. My university funded my flight for me to get here. But otherwise, I'm just kind of here. I'm teaching a class at the local university, and I'm kind of just hanging out because I want to learn about this place. And it was hard for people to understand that because everyone's positionality was shaped vis-a-vis power. Everyone's positionality was shaped vis-a-vis power that existed. And it's not easy for people like Hanan, this lawyer I mentioned, to stand up and say, Am I an environmentalist? Am I a human rights activist? Am I a women's rights activist? It's not easy for people to get up and share their positionality. As I shared my positionality kind of throughout this talk, it's not easy for people to do this. And because it's not easy for people to do this, let me get to this last subpoint in section 2 on the price of positionality, the consequences of positionality. When an author consciously blurs the boundaries between the personal and the professional, some people appreciate it. Some people appreciate it. But a lot of people think that some people might think this is not real research. This is not real research. This challenges what the idea of scholarship even means to people. And that can generate self-doubt. That can generate anxiety. It can generate a loss of emotional stamina when people do it and they keep getting asked about their research in ways that don't match the way they do their research. It can lead to exhaustion, especially if people are constantly asked, and this happens a lot to people who may be different in some kind of way. People are often asked to represent their gender, represent their particular minority background, their particular ability level, their particular gender identity. And that can lead to exhaustion when they want to be themselves, but also they're asked to represent a whole category of people that is different and diverse in and of itself. In some cases, gendered and any kind of minoritized scholar can risk reifying hierarchies that exist by expressing their positionality. They can risk reifying existing power hierarchies. This can involve communicating painful memories. This can involve, say, women, scholars of color, other minoritized scholars, performing their difference, while people who aren't performing their difference remaining unmarked. So to be more crude about it, women, scholars of color are performing their difference while white men remain completely unmarked. They get away with not having to perform any difference, which can risk reifying the existing hierarchies in our profession and in society. I mean, in some ways, was I, and I don't know the answer to this question, which is why I ask it, was I reifying existing hierarchies by answering all of those questions in that job interview I mentioned many years ago? Should I have told this person? The questions you're asking are actually against the law. I would like to assert my rights. Should I have done that? That would have felt very awkward to me. Did I succumb to power? Did I submit myself to power rather than subvert power as it existed? I think choosing some kind of objectivity in social science, which I think we care about a lot in the sociology of law, as radical as sociology of law is, I think we do care about objectivity and neutrality. I think choosing some kind of objectivity over positionality can be a sinister parallel to the way that law itself exceptionalizes, generalizes, and criminalizes unusual people or behavior. And that's the point. If there's one point I want you to see from this talk today, especially as law and society scholars, as students of the sociology of law, as socio-legal scholars, is this, that positionality shifts attention away from the abstract rules of law that our colleagues in law schools are so focused on understanding. And there's something important about that project of understanding the abstract rules of law. But there's also something important about understanding the personhood behind the law. And indeed, Reza Banakar himself referred to law as a form of experience. And I think what what he may have been trying to do was talk about the human dimensions of the law, was talk about the ways that human beings are animating what the law means, who creates the law, the power behind the law, who has to submit to law, who succumbs to the law, and the force of the law. That there is a human experience to all of this. And to me, positionality kind of brings that, remembering positionality brings that back. And to me, that's really the heart of our field of sociology of law, is not just thinking about what the law is and what the law does and what the law says, but removing that agency from the law and bringing it back to the human, so that humans are once again the agents of the law and not the law as the agent of the human. And I think Reza Banakar was trying to do that with his work. Okay, I've spoken about the benefits of positionality. I've spoken about the burdens of positionality and who shares positionality and why. Let me spend the last few minutes talking about why I'm sharing all this information with you. And I'm sharing all this information with you. What I want you to take away from this is the following points. First, positionality is not just for qualitative researchers. The way we interpret quantitative data, the way we interpret text, the way we interpret visual images, the way we interpret audible sounds, all of these can be influenced by our backgrounds. All of these can be influenced by our privileges, whether we're able to even interpret these kinds of things. And all of these can be influenced by our marginalization, not just qualitative research. Second, and I want to make sure this point is emphasized, as important as positionality is for a lot of people, I don't think that there should be a requirement that everyone is forced to. I don't think a journal, for instance, should have the requirement of you must have a statement of positionality. Why? Because I don't think it's worth forcing anyone. No one should have to apologize for their stories. No one should have to tell their stories. People should be free to tell their stories when and if they are ready to tell their stories, if indeed that's what positionality is about. And I think we may be heading down a road where positionality might be different from telling stories. It may be something even more than that. I think what can be useful for scholars to do is adopt, and I mentioned this at the start of the talk, adopt a position sensibility. Okay, what do I mean by a position sensibility? I mean that when all of us do our research, when you go back and do your 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 research, that you think about every step of the process. How is my positionality influencing my research right now? How is it influencing my research right now? How is it influencing my research now? What about today? What about when I met Hanan, this environmental lawyer? What about when I'm in this job interview? What about when I'm giving the Reza Banakar Memorial Lecture? What about when I'm back with my students teaching? In all of these circumstances, thinking about positionality. Why do I invite people to do this? To engage in this kind of position sensibility, to keep positionality in your mind. Why? Because for some people, they don't have the luxury of not doing that. Because every step they take, positionality is just part of what they're doing. And so if we can all experience that together, whether or not we ultimately write about it, we'll then know how hard it is to do the work of positionality. If we can think about it in the way that some people do, we'll understand and appreciate that when some people write about one paragraph positionality, the amount of hard work that actually goes into that. That's what I mean about adopting a position sensibility. Now, remember I said that there were 36 authors, 28 articles in Journal of Law and Society Review, 36 authors, 28 articles. In the 56 some odd years of the history of these journals where people talked about positionality, one-third of those articles were only in the last 3 years. Now, if that says something, it could be that this is just a blip on the historical radar, or it could mean that change is on the horizon. It could mean that change is on the horizon. If change is on the horizon, now let me conclude with that, with some remarks. Here, I offer myself. I offer my personal experience. I offer my professional experience. I offer myself to you, given that I'm speaking about positionality. And it's with some trepidation that I do this. And I remember the admonition of the ancient Greek philosophers to know yourself. My family sought refuge from Sudan 4 decades ago when I was a boy. We carried little with us except faith and a desire for a better life in the United States. And since then, thousands of Sudanese people have attempted the same journey. I have had many fortunes in my life, many privileges in my life since my parents made that decision 40 years ago. I have survived dictatorship. I immigrated. Got to give this lecture. I got to teach. And I got to challenge the orthodoxy in our profession, that law and religion and politics are different when they only seem so because we teach them in our separate faculties of divinity or law schools or political science departments. And that's been the greatest joy of all. And through my positionality, I've also been able to learn something through the privilege of my positionality, actually. Not the marginalization, but the privilege. I've been able to learn that I've been able to draw a line from the secularism of the colonial law that my parents lived under to the secularism of the human rights law that I was trained under, to the secularism of our academy that I work under. And my final point here that I've shared through my writing, and I hope through our conversation about positionality, is that part of positionality is knowing ourselves as well as we know our scholarship can help us to make something good in the face of death in this world. So thank you for your time. Thank you to the Sociology of Law Department. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. Thank you, Reza Banakar, for the work you've done. And I look forward to our comments, to your comments and our discussion on the power of positionality and fieldwork in law and society.